Ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you something that might sound uncomfortable at first, but it's the truth. You are not responsible for how someone else feels. You are responsible for your words, your actions, your intentions, but the emotions that rise up in another person, that belongs to them. Think about it. You can say something kind, clear, and respectful, and still someone may twist it, misunderstand it, or choose to be offended. And what do most of us do? We rush to fix it. We apologize for things we didn't do wrong. We explain ourselves over and over. We carry guilt like it's our job. But it isn't. Their reaction is their choice. So I'm going to teach you exactly what to do. Everyone sees life through their own lens. That lens is shaped by their past, their fears, their insecurities, and their beliefs. You cannot control that lens, no matter how hard you try. If someone wakes up angry at the world, you smiling at them won't fix it. If someone decides to feel hurt by your boundary, that doesn't mean you're cruel. It means they wanted access to something they weren't entitled to. When you take responsibility for other people's emotions, you end up living life like a hostage. Every word you say, every decision you make, you second guess because you're worried about how they might feel. That's not peace, that's prison. And here's the thing, even when you do everything right, they still might not be happy. You are allowed to say no without guilt. You are allowed to set boundaries without explaining yourself into exhaustion. You are allowed to protect your peace without carrying the weight of their disappointment. That's not being selfish. That's being healthy. Of course, this doesn't mean you stop caring about people. It doesn't mean you ignore their emotions. It means you understand the difference between empathy and responsibility. Empathy says, I hear you, I understand that's how you feel. Responsibility says, I'll carry your emotions on my back as if they're my fault. And that's where you draw the line. The truth is, the moment you stop trying to manage other people's feelings, you'll start breathing easier. You'll realize you can't control how someone reacts, but you can control how you respond. You can choose calm instead of panic, clarity instead of over-explaining, boundaries instead of burnout. People's emotions are influenced by their own perspective, experiences, and choices. And when we really stop to think about that, it changes the way we carry ourselves in relationships, conversations, and even conflicts. The way one person interprets a word or an action is never universal because it is filtered through a lifetime of moments, beliefs, and scars that shape how they see the world. Two people can hear the exact same sentence and walk away with completely different feelings about it. That isn't because the words changed, it is because each individual has their own history, their own lens, and their own interpretation. This is why you can be speaking with pure intentions and someone may still find offense. It's not always about what was said, but about what it reminded them of, what insecurity it pressed against, or what story they've already been telling themselves about who they are and how the world treats them. Imagine for a moment two people standing in front of a painting. One sees it as beautiful, vibrant, and full of life, while the other sees it as chaotic, confusing, and even upsetting. The painting didn't change. The colors didn't rearrange themselves. What changed is the lens of the viewer. The same principle applies to our emotions. Every emotional reaction is a mixture of what is happening now and what has already happened in the past. That is why some people are easily offended by something small while others brush it off like it's nothing. It's why certain words that are harmless to you can feel like daggers to someone else. It's not always about the present, it's about the story that's been building long before this moment arrived. This truth can feel frustrating because it means we can't control how others feel no matter how carefully we move. You can speak softly, explain gently, choose every word with precision, and someone may still misinterpret your heart. But that's because their emotions don't belong to you. They belong to them. Their perspective, shaped by their experiences and their choices, colors how they receive you. If someone has lived through betrayal, even your honesty might be doubted. If someone has lived through neglect, even your presence may not feel like enough. That's not a reflection of your worth, but a reflection of what they carry. This is why relationships and conversations often clash, not because people are cruel, but because people are different. Each person is walking around with invisible luggage filled with memories, fears, and lessons learned the hard way, and every interaction is filtered through that luggage. When someone snaps at you, it may not be about you at all. It may be about the 1,000 small frustrations they've carried from their day or from their past. When someone distances themselves, it may not mean you did something wrong. It may mean closeness is something they've been taught to fear. Their choices and their emotions are often tied to things you will never see or know. Understanding this doesn't mean you ignore people's emotions or dismiss them as unimportant. It means you recognize the difference between being empathetic and being responsible. Empathy says, I can try to understand why you feel that way, even if I don't share the same perspective. Responsibility, however, says, your feelings are my fault, and it's my job to fix them. That's where so many of us burn out, trying to control something that isn't ours to control. You cannot erase someone's past. You cannot rewrite their perspective. You cannot choose their reaction for them. What you can do is show up with clarity, kindness, and truth, and then let them decide what to do with it. When you understand that emotions are shaped by perspectives, experiences, and choices, you begin to step into freedom. You stop personalizing every negative reaction. You stop apologizing for things that weren't wrong. You stop bending yourself into a shape that pleases everyone else while breaking yourself in the process. You realize that their anger, their disappointment, or their silence is more about the road they've walked than the step you just took. And from that place, you can breathe easier. You can speak more honestly. You can love without fear of being crushed by rejection. Every person has a story, and their emotions are just chapters of that story spilling into the present moment. Some chapters are full of pain. Others are full of joy, and some are still being written with confusion. But none of those chapters were written by you. You may enter the story, you may influence a line or two, but you are not the author. And when you accept that, you start living lighter because you stop carrying responsibility that never belonged to you in the first place. You can offer kindness and clarity, but you cannot control how someone chooses to feel, and that truth can save you a lifetime of unnecessary guilt. We often believe that if we explain ourselves enough, if we soften our tone enough, if we choose just the right words, then people will understand our intentions and feel the way we want them to feel. But emotions do not work that way. You can be kind, respectful, and thoughtful, and still, someone may decide to take offense. You can explain yourself with perfect clarity, and still they may choose to hear only what fits the story they have already written in their mind. That is because their feelings are theirs to own, not yours to control. Think about how many times you've gone out of your way to be gentle with someone to avoid hurting them, only to see them upset anyway. You replay the conversation in your head, trying to find the exact word or gesture that must have gone wrong. But often it wasn't your word or your gesture. It was their interpretation. Their response came from their history, their insecurities, or simply the mood they were in that day. The same words that bring comfort to one person can trigger defensiveness in another. The difference lies not in what was said, but in the perspective of the one hearing it. That is why clarity is so important, but also why clarity has limits. You can explain your intentions, you can share your reasoning, you can even be transparent about your motives, but at the end of the day, how they process that information is beyond your reach. If someone wants to misunderstand you, they will. If someone is determined to see you as the villain, no amount of kindness will rewrite the role they have already cast you in. Your responsibility is to speak with truth and compassion, not to twist yourself into knots trying to manage their emotional reaction. It is tempting to think that if we just keep explaining, eventually people will see our heart. But sometimes the more you explain, the less they hear because they are not listening to understand, they are listening to defend their own narrative. That is why over-explaining often leaves you exhausted and still misjudged. It's not that you weren't clear enough, it's that they were not open enough. And that is not something you can control. What you can do, however, is offer kindness. Kindness does not mean agreeing with everything someone wants. Kindness does not mean abandoning your boundaries just to keep them comfortable. Kindness means you deliver your truth without cruelty, without unnecessary harshness, without the intention to wound. But once that truth is spoken with care, your work is done. Their emotional reaction belongs to them. If they feel hurt, that feeling may be real, but it doesn't automatically mean you were wrong. Hurt is not always the result of harm. Sometimes it is the result of unmet expectations or unhealed wounds. The same applies to positive emotions. You can pour kindness into someone, but you cannot force them to feel grateful. You can give them clarity, but you cannot make them trust you. Some people will receive your love and still feel unloved because they don't know how to let it in. Others will receive your honesty and still feel attacked because honesty to them feels like rejection. That has more to do with their inner world than your outer behavior. This truth is both frustrating and freeing. Frustrating because no matter how much you care, you cannot dictate another person's feelings. Freeing because it releases you from the endless responsibility of carrying emotions that are not yours. You don't have to solve every misunderstanding. You don't have to bend every boundary. You don't have to keep apologizing for feelings you didn't create. What you owe others is kindness and clarity. What you owe yourself is peace. When you begin to live this way, relationships become less about control and more about honesty. You no longer tiptoe through life afraid of how people might feel about every choice you make. Instead, you make decisions rooted in respect and truth, and then you let others manage their own reactions. That is not coldness, that is maturity. Because at the end of the day, emotions are deeply personal. Each person chooses how to interpret, how to react, and how to feel. And once you've offered kindness and clarity, you've already given the best of yourself. The rest was never in your hands to begin with. Think about how exhausting it feels when you constantly try to guess how others might react. You second guess a simple no because you're afraid it might disappoint them. You hesitate to set a boundary because you worry they'll think you're unkind. You soften your truth until it no longer resembles what you really mean just to keep someone else comfortable. In those moments, your peace is not your own. It's being held hostage by their reaction. And the more you live that way, the more drained you become because you are carrying emotions that were never meant for your shoulders. Your peace is precious, and it can't survive if you are constantly managing other people's emotions. Energy is like currency. You only have so much of it each day. If you spend it all trying to soothe, explain, and convince others to see the right way, you'll have nothing left for yourself. You'll notice it in your body, the heaviness in your chest, the tension in your shoulders, the fatigue that doesn't go away. You'll notice it in your mind, the overthinking, the constant self-doubt, the endless need to please. You'll notice it in your spirit, the lack of joy, the feeling that you're never enough no matter how much you give. That is the cost of carrying what isn't yours. When you try to control how someone reacts, you give them your power. You live life waiting for their response before you decide how you're allowed to feel. But when you release that burden, you take your power back. You realize that their anger doesn't have to become your guilt, their disappointment doesn't have to become your shame, and their misunderstanding doesn't have to become your responsibility. You learn to separate what is yours from what is theirs. And in doing so, you find freedom. Of course, this doesn't mean you stop caring about people or become insensitive to their feelings. It means you recognize where empathy ends and overt responsibility begins. You can acknowledge someone's emotions without absorbing them. You can listen with compassion without making it your job to fix what they're feeling. You can offer kindness and clarity without surrendering your energy in the process. Because at the end of the day, no matter how much you care, you cannot live their lives for them. The weight of other people's reactions is not meant for you to carry. Every time you pick it up, you lose a little more of yourself. But every time you put it down, you regain your peace, your strength, and your freedom. And that is how you protect the energy you need to live fully, without being drained by what was never yours to hold. Setting boundaries is not cruelty. It's respect for yourself and for them, though for many of us, it doesn't always feel that way in the moment. We are often taught to associate boundaries with rejection, coldness, or even selfishness, so when we say no or when we draw a line, guilt quickly follows. We start worrying about whether the other person will think less of us, whether they'll feel hurt, or whether they'll decide we don't care about them. But the truth is, boundaries are not walls to push people away. They are guideposts that help relationships remain healthy, balanced, and honest. Boundaries are an expression of clarity. They say, this is how far I can go without losing myself, or this is what I need to stay whole. When you communicate a boundary, you are not shutting someone out. You are showing them the safest way to be in relationship with you. Think of it like a property line around a home. The line isn't there to lock people out. It's there to define where the home begins and ends, where care and responsibility lie. Without that line, people trample without realizing, damage what they never intended to, and leave you feeling violated without ever knowing why. Boundaries are not cruelty, they are clarity. Respecting yourself enough to set limits is one of the kindest things you can do, both for you and for the people around you. When you live without boundaries, resentment builds. You say yes when you want to say no. You give time and energy you don't have. You stretch yourself thin to meet everyone else's needs, only to feel overlooked, unappreciated, and exhausted. Eventually, that quiet frustration spills over into passive anger, silent treatment, or distance. Without boundaries, relationships don't get better, they fracture. With boundaries, though, people know what to expect, and trust is built, because your yes means yes and your no means no. People may not always like your boundaries, but liking them and respecting them are two different things. At first, some may resist, especially if they were used to having access to you without limits. But over time, healthy people come to value boundaries because they create safety. A friend who knows their limits is a friend you can trust. A colleague who communicates what they can and cannot do is someone you can rely on. A partner who can say no without fear is a partner who can also say yes with sincerity. Boundaries keep relationships honest, which is far more loving than pretending to be okay while secretly feeling drained or resentful. It's important to remember that boundaries are not punishments. They're not about controlling someone else. They're about taking responsibility for yourself. A punishment says, "You did this, so I'll hurt you back." A boundary says, "This is what I need to stay healthy regardless of what you choose to do." That distinction matters because when boundaries are misunderstood as cruelty, people assume they are about rejection. In reality, they are an invitation. They are an invitation to relate with respect, to engage without harm, and to build trust without fear of hidden resentment. When you set a boundary, you are also teaching people how to treat you. If you constantly accept disrespect, people learn that it's okay to disrespect you. If you constantly give beyond your capacity, people learn that you'll always sacrifice yourself for their comfort. But when you establish a limit, you are saying, "This is what's acceptable and this is what isn't." You are teaching through action, not through complaint, and people tend to listen more deeply to the boundaries you live by than the frustration you express without them. For yourself, boundaries preserve energy and peace. Life is already demanding enough without carrying the weight of everyone else's expectations. Without boundaries, you run on empty, constantly pouring out with no time to refill. With boundaries, you conserve your energy for what matters most, which means when you give, it's genuine. It's not forced, not resentful, not obligatory. It's real. That makes your relationship stronger because people can trust that your presence and your effort come from choice, not from guilt. So setting boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of respect. Respect for yourself because you honor your own needs, your own energy, and your own peace. Respect for others because you give them clarity, honesty, and the chance to engage with you in a healthy way. And while not everyone will appreciate your boundaries, the people who truly value you will, because they'll recognize that your lines are not about pushing them away, but about making space for relationships that are healthier, stronger, and more sustainable. Boundaries may cause discomfort in the moment, but in the long run they build trust, freedom, and respect, the very things every relationship needs to survive. Freedom comes when you stop over-explaining and start accepting that their feelings are not your responsibility, because the truth is, no amount of explanation can ever guarantee that someone will see your intentions clearly. Over-explaining comes from a place of fear, the fear of being misunderstood, judged, or rejected. You repeat yourself again and again, searching for the perfect words that will finally convince the other person that you meant no harm, that you are not the villain, that your heart was in the right place. But what you discover is that the more you explain, the less peace you have, because you are trying to control something you were never meant to control the way another person chooses to feel. When you feel the urge to over-explain, it often means you've already said what needed to be said, but you don't trust it was enough. You keep adding words, hoping that if you just provide more detail, more context, or more reassurance, then the other person's emotions will shift into acceptance or approval. But emotions don't always respond to logic. Someone who has already decided to be upset may stay upset no matter how much you clarify. Someone who wants to see you through a negative lens may twist your words until they fit the story they've already created. And in that moment, all of your over-explaining becomes less about clarity and more about desperation. Accepting that their feelings are not your responsibility doesn't mean you stop caring about people. It doesn't mean you ignore their emotions or shut down empathy. It means you recognize the boundary between compassion and control. You can acknowledge that someone feels hurt. You can validate that their emotions are real to them. But you cannot force them to feel differently. You cannot talk someone out of anger if they want to hold on to it. You cannot explain your way into someone's forgiveness if they are committed to resentment. And you cannot convince someone of your worth if they are determined not to see it. That acceptance is where true freedom begins. Over-explaining steals your confidence because it sends the message that your words, as they are not enough. It makes you doubt your intentions, even when they were pure. It drains your energy as you chase after an outcome that isn't yours to deliver. And the worst part is, it rarely works. Instead of reassuring the other person, it often makes them focus more on the problem. Instead of creating peace, it creates tension, because the conversation drags on long past the point of clarity. The harder you try to control their reaction, the more powerless you feel when you realize it isn't changing. Freedom looks different. Freedom is saying what you mean with kindness and clarity, and then letting the rest belong to them. Freedom is knowing that you can speak honestly without needing to defend every word until the other person finally agrees. Freedom is trusting that the people who truly want to understand you will, and the ones who don't were never going to, no matter how much you said. Freedom is walking away from the cycle of constant justification because you know your intentions were clean, and that is enough. When you stop over-explaining, you reclaim your peace. You find that you don't need to have the last word in every conversation. You don't need to write a novel to defend a simple decision. You don't need to manage every flicker of disappointment, frustration, or misunderstanding in the people around you. You start valuing silence as much as speech because silence protects your energy. You realize that sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is the one you don't keep repeating. It can feel uncomfortable at first, especially if you're used to living as a people pleaser. You might feel guilty, like you're being careless or cold. But over time, you see that stepping back doesn't mean you don't care. It means you care enough about yourself not to carry what isn't yours. You care enough about the relationship not to let it drown in endless explanations. You care enough about your peace not to trade it for the fleeting satisfaction of someone's temporary approval. Freedom isn't found in making everyone happy. It isn't found in managing every emotion in the room. It's found in drawing a line between what you can control and what you cannot. You can control your words, your tone, your honesty, your respect. You cannot control whether someone receives them with grace or with anger. That choice belongs entirely to them. And when you finally stop over-explaining and accept that reality, you stop living life as if you're on trial every day, and you start living with the calm that comes from knowing you've already said enough.